I will get you out of here, Eric concluded decisively, and offered a hand to Osrith, to pull her up to higher ground. She took it, and climbed her feet up the rock and onto chalk grassland. Do not let Siegfried see you, or he will kill you, he added. Not if I kill him first, Osrith declared. But this time it was Eric's turn to frown. You will not go? Osrith shook her head. I have taken on something of honor, for the Lord I swore to. Eric nodded his head, understanding the gravity of what she was saying. Uhtred came to negotiate a price for Ethelfled, and that Dyrd of Mercia, he continued. He is my lord, Osrith replied, thinking of the stuck-up, feebly intelligent lord of the Mersons. Uhtred the Dyrd, Osrith specified, as they walked slowly to the East Saxon fortress. I was supposed to guard Ethelfled. You did not do a good job. I was taken from that job to lead men against you at Lundin. You would not have her now if I had been her guard still. I have no doubt, Eric replied, stepping over a low boundary wall that delineated two long deserted farms. But your lord, is he not in Alba? Osrith stopped, sharply. It was like you said, Osrith admitted. He had betrayed me. He had arranged for that marriage in Caeliquilid. Then you were right to leave. But why Ethelred? I was in Wessex. It did not suit. They are rich and Osrith did not know the words arrogant from the riches. I did not fit there. There was more that her tone conveyed, and Eric picked up on it. If the bastard who has upset you is here, I will kill him. Osrith smiled, at his ready defense of her. He might be, she replied, non-committally. Is it Uhtred? And Osrith found herself agreeing. You are in love with him? I have seen the way you have looked at him, when he was here, to negotiate the ransom. And Osrith had stared. It was true. But, if she had been staring at her brother, then it was because she was trying so hard not to stare at Finan. My heart is empty of that feeling, Osrith replied. I your husband, to whom you promised, I remember. Eric's sentence trailed to nothing as he thought. Then he began walking towards Beamflout again. Something to do with hands. Hands. He died, in the battle between my Lord King and the Strathclyde Cymry. I am sorry. He burned to death trying to save the lives of innocents, set by Greogair. Remember him? I remember what he did to you, Eric replied, gently, and he glanced at her body. I saw his marks upon you still. He herded them in, like cattle, then ordered his men to set the fire. Tagged, Osrith found herself whispering his name. He handed me his seeks. Osrith put her hand to it. Then her voice stuck on a hard edge. And Domhnall could not deny his treachery, in the end, and put him to the sword. Very good. But Osrith was now saying nothing. To love like that, Eric mused. I know it, thought. Uhtred. He looked across to her, slyly, and something in Osrith's brain made her say the most impossible thing. It turns out I do not eye of him as I expected to. Eric's shock was palpable and he stared at her face, waiting for Osrith to tell him that she was joking. Uhtred? You expected to love Uhtred? He asked, not expecting this from his gentle teasing. She drew to a stop, and reached for the Norseman's hands. Do you not love your brother? And afterwards, Osrith thought how good it had felt to tell him. Uhtred is your brother? Eric repeated. But Osrith said nothing more, yet could not stop herself from nodding, before stepping away from him, her hand gripping tagged seeks for security. She had opened up. Now it was time to close down. I am pleased the princess is well, Osrith said, stiffly, and began to walk in the direction of the Lundin road. You are going? Eric asked. But her feint did not fool the Northman in the slightest, and he followed this question with, no, you have a plan, I can tell. And Osrith turned back to him, buoy in her hand. I will fight you and I will win, she told him, defiantly. I do not love Wessex but I am sworn to Mercia. Much as I respect you, Eric Thurgilson, you cannot be allowed to ruin the kingdom. But now, it was Eric's turn to fall silent, and Osrith watched a pensive, serious expression take hold of his features. Then, he gently placed a hand on Osrith's back, as if guiding her in the direction of the Merson and Wessex encampment. Go, Leave. I will give you passage. Get back to your army and tell them the princess is well. But you are ransoming her enough to ruin both kingdoms. Osrith protested, for, while she had bathed, her mind had run through a dozen different plans, and had settled on two which could work. Both included Elfkin's help, and she looked forward to finding him, and telling him his help was crucial. But Eric was not protesting, or trying to argue with her. Indeed, he looked worried. It will not come to that, He broke off, and looked, almost pained, back to Beamflout. And then Osrith knew. If she had known what a jigsaw puzzle was, she might have used that analogy in her head. All of the pieces had flown together and she could see the majority of the picture. He's helping her, isn't he? Helping you both? My, she found she could not say it. You did? Ethelflad said he would. Then he will, Osrith assured him. Where will you go? Francia. I have family there. Then gods, be with you, she said, with a finality. It was good to see you again, Eric Thurgilson. You too, Osrith Lackland. He paused, then proposed, Osrith of ... Bibbenberg. No, she shot back, firmly. Never. I am Osrith the Gale, Osrith the Warrior, Osrith of Northumbria, as you had me to be. And then she noticed a strange light in his eyes. Kriegwind, join us. And just for a moment, Osrith considered it. She would be accepted. She could fight. They would no doubt allow her to be Christian. Faith was a private matter, not one that bound you to regular attendance at a church, and a Thor's hammer would please outwardly. Osrith took Eric's hands in hers again, feeling them warm, where hers were cold. I am Osrith the Merson, Utadkin of Bibbenberg. I never want to see that place again in my life. Tack, she added. For what? For teaching me Norse. It got me in here, that is certain. Eric grinned. For being a thoroughly good warrior and, when I needed one, a fine friend. For believing that I am a good enough warrior to be Norse. Eric stepped away first, and looked towards the fortress, before looking back to Osrith. Osrith the Merson, he declared, if I should face you on the battlefield, I will turn from you, and planted a kiss on her cheek. Osrith threw her arms around him. And I from you, Eric Thurgilson, and I from you. 88,888,888. Miral twitched as a rustle of vegetation caught his ear. Alert, he strode to Elfgar, who woke Elfrith, who was dozing by the campfire. All guards were alert since the capture of Ethelflad, over a month ago, and yes, there were feet, not approaching the camp honestly, but sneaking up on them. A Dane, Miral presumed, a stinking spy, who a crack underfoot, in the opposite direction had the commander turning. Two of them. But it was Aldhelm, who had his sword aloft and who touched Miral on the arm. In the moonlight, he saw the king's right-hand man nod. He had heard the noise too, and presumed the same. Aldhelm twitched his sword in the direction of the noise and strode carefully towards it. Elfgar nodded to Elfrith and then gestured in the direction of the men, Osrith's men. Although every day he was assuming her role. A scream rang out and a commotion as Miral turned. Leaving Elfgar to his men, Miral hurried to his lord. Aldhelm was holding his hand. He bit me, the bastard, but he broke off when he saw Miral had put his arm around her shoulders. It's all right, Miral replied, pulling Osrith to him. It's bloody not, the bastard, I'm sorry, Lord Aldhelm, Osrith interjected. I came, when I could. Osrith. Aldhelm's voice was flat, for she had bitten him very hard. Over a bowl of stew, Osrith told her commanders that Ethelflad was safe, or as safe as she could be under the circumstances. They are treating her with respect, Osrith clarified, through bites of bread. What can be done? In your opinion, Osrith, what can be done? Aldhelm, still touching his hand every so often, made his question plain. But he was looking at a face which was scanning the horizon, and he turned. Miral was, himself, rising to his feet. Osrith had heard the noise, too. Perhaps she had. Perhaps it was her own heart beating. Could you go back? Aldhelm asked, his voice quick and distracted. I could go back, Osrith agreed. I did not leave being pursued. I could go back. She got to her feet. Time to share her plans. I could get close to the lady. I could help her. She nodded. Our army could get close enough, and then you could attack. If the Lady Ethelfled is in no immediate danger, get close to her, Aldhelm commanded. If you can, if the Danes and Norse are in disarray, help her flee. Somehow, get her away from Beamflout. We have the army, plus we have the Wessex army. And, as Osrith was about to leave, she saw what Miral and Aldhelm were beginning to look at, and heard it herself. There was a rumble in the earth, getting louder, until an army rode straight into the Wessex encampment. 2 Wessex armies, then, said Miral, and Osrith followed them across to see the Lord Odda dismount and stand before King Alfred. As she looked, Osrith could see chests on a cart, guarded by West Saxons. He had brought the money then, she thought, grimly. The King of Wessex was about to forfeit the kingdom, and surrender every person living in it. The king is here? Osrith asked, as Odda bowed to Alfred. She saw her former lord take in the view of the precious metal. He arrived a week ago, wanted to oversee the proceedings. As Osrith looked, she saw men she knew, Odda's men. He had raised the Devonshire Fid, for what he considered a last stand against the Danes to protect his homeland. Elfgar had explained to her that without the express permission of the king, it was treachery. But Osrith could not blame her former lord. Indeed, she respected his decision. What was Alfred thinking, allowing it to get that far? Allowing men to feel so desperate that they would defy him to save their kingdom. Yet, Ethelfled was his favorite, and he was a father. Even if he had tried to manage the situation, she was different. She was always different. Not even his son, Edward, would have provoked him to be standing within a mile of the fortress that might have held him. Alfred was in it until the end, whatever that end was. Indistinct thoughts were clouding in the back of Osrith's mind as she watched the king welcome his lord. Alfred was clever, Senard, as Domhnall might say. He used his head. There was intelligent cunning behind the man. Was it really gold and silver displayed so obviously in view to anyone who would care to look, or just boxes that contained nothing more valuable than air? And if it were gold and silver, did he have a backup plan? I will do what I can, Osrith said, vaguely. And then, because if she hadn't asked, she would never have forgiven herself, do I get my men back? Osrith, Aldhelm said, peering down his nose at her, as was his habit to most people, being so tall. If you could bring the Lady Ethelfled safely back to us, you can have your men back. Heaven. You can have any men you like back. The whole army. Just bring her back. And so Osrith said nothing more, looked nothing further upon the reuniting of the King of Wessex and his dearest lord, who was now his greatest traitor. Instead, she strode towards Beamflout, to liberate the king's daughter. 88,888,888. Osrith heard the noise before she could see the gates of Beamflout. The noise of merriment, raucousness, drunkenness in full swing. The gates were closed, but not guarded, so clearly the brothers had decided to allow their men to relax and celebrate the wealth that was soon to be theirs. The stables had been opened and there were men hanging out of the windows, laughing, vomiting, pissing in corners. They were happy, and were celebrating, and games were being played, one which Osrith remembered from the Thurgilson's Yule celebrations, a tug-of-war. They were this side of drunk, with enough faculties to still be entertained by games. How to blend in, Osrith thought, and took up a tankard from a very soused Dane who was lying in a bundle of horse feed, snoring, and pretended to stagger around, looking pleased and happy. A voice came to her ear and a hand to her elbow, and Osrith jumped, seeing Rorik, a look of concern on his face. He had never seen her before she had arrived at Beamflout disguised, but had accepted Osrith to be Norse or Danish, in a very matter-of-fact way. That he had noticed her absence was both touching, but also concerning. She swung her wooden pot towards him and grinned what she hoped was the grin of the merry. Osrith, where have you been? Looking for the princess, she replied, swinging her tankard towards the place Ethelfled was, or had been the last time she had seen her. But Rorik put his hand to her mouth. You've been looking for her all the time? Come, he ushered, and led her to the main hall. The Lord Eric put her aloft, so all can see who is to bring her treasure, Rorik explained, pointing upwards. In a cage level with a gantry used, From what Osrith could see, as an access point to it, sat the daughter of Alfred. She was sitting, knees to her chest and her arms wrapped around her legs, and, as Osrith looked, her face was red. It looked as if she had been crying. It was no wonder you could not find her. Did the food go to waste? I took it back to the kitchens, Osrith replied, thinking quickly. And by the look of the amount of maids usually working in the kitchens now keeping the tipsy Northman company, added, there wasn't anyone about, no one told me. She looked in the direction of the kitchens again. I wonder, should I go back and give it to her? But Rorik shook his head. You are one of Eric's men, are you not? He asked, and Osrith wondered whether she detected a touch of suspicion in his face. But it passed quickly when he added, my Lord Heston said we need to be aware, there is trouble. She cannot starve, Osrith said, hoping the concern was out of the ultimate idea of wealth and glory. I will get her food, then. She thrust the drinking cup towards him. Right, said Rorik, brightly, and took it. The kitchens were indeed deserted. Food which was destined for eating lay half prepared on plates. A roast pig on a spit had been only a little stripped of its flesh, and bread was on the table along with apples, and large flagons of ale were standing, as if waiting to be taken out. To a table somewhere, behind her, stumbled a Northman, who hailed her with a fist before stumbling off with a plate of bread and pork. It was her chance, Osrith thought. Already, it was assumed her job was to give Ethelfled her food, so by climbing up to her to hand it over, Osrith would be in a position to see how she could get her down. So, she started to prepare a bowl of pork and bread, apples and a jug of ale, something which she had brought to Ethelfled daily and would not look amiss. It was when she was turning to go that she found him, her youngest warrior. She had seen Elfkin before at the stables, and now, shrinking behind the thick oak door as she watched the boy come to help himself to the good food before him. Osrith was pleased to see as he fed himself, that Elfkin was not thin and looked well treated. He jumped when Osrith stepped towards him, however, a look of horror on his face. Clearly, Osrith looked like a Dane to him, and, as a slave, he should not be eating all that food. Elfkin, she said gently, and watched the boy's expression change. Captain? He asked, tentatively. Osrith nodded. I heard you were captured. I have come to bring you back. You, and the lady, she added, for a closer approximation of the truth. Now, she is up there, the Lady Ethelfled. Elfkin nodded. So we are going to get her out. Somehow. I have a plan. And Osrith told him the plan. She told him that he was to pass out as much ale from the pots as possible, spend most of the night doing that, making the men more and more drunk. While you are doing that, I am going to get her down, and we are going to take the horses. They are free, are they not? Unguarded, Elfkin agreed, grinning. And, I have seen you tend them, so I know they are fit to ride out of the fortress to the camp. Elfkin grinned more, pleased at her praise of him. Do you have your sword? Osrith asked, and at once, his face fell. It was taken from me when the Danes came, he said, sadly. So Osrith felt herself reach to her hip, and she withdrew her own seeks, once tagged. She held it out to him, and Elfkin went to take it, but at the last moment, Osrith drew it away from him. I want it back, when you're done, she added, before taking off its belted scabbard. Elfkin buckled it over his shoulder, so it hung crossways over his body, and thrust the seeks inside it. I will make you proud, Captain, Elfkin declared. You'll see. And so Osrith climbed the steps to the gantry that hung by Ethelfled's cage, watching Elfkin go about the plan. It was working stupendously, and, as she watched, the drunken behavior of the Norse and Danes grew steadily more stupid and dangerous. Only Heston, who looked extremely unsettled, pacing around, unable to settle with his ale, was spoiling this unanimous intoxication. And Eric, for she noticed that whenever Elfkin brought him ale, he took it, and then was pouring a good deal into his brother's pot, or away near the table, feigning merriment as he sat around the table. Not once, Osrith noticed, did Eric look up to Ethelfled. Yet, there did not seem to be despair in her face, only tiredness and exhaustion. My thanks, Ethelfled said to Osrith as she passed the food through to the lady. but she shook her hand when Ethelfled tried to give her a silver piece. "I have silver enough of my own," Osrith rebuked, "and some would think I own more, and think me a thief." That was enough to make her heart burst open with revenge joy, to see the look on Ethelfled's face as she realized who Osrith was. The lady had the grace to look down for a moment, and then reach out to her hand. "I followed you to the Britons that night," Ethelfled confessed. "I heard you telling Edward, and I told Ethelwold." Her cornflower blue eyes still seemed to sparkle in the darkness when she asked, "Do you hate me?" And Osrith found herself shaking her head. "I think you were cruel to your brother," Osrith said, carefully. What she wanted to say she did not. What she wanted to say was she was sorry that Ethelfled was born a princess not a prince, for that was what she truly wanted to be, and she had taken her envy and resentment out on Edward. "You would understand if you had a brother," Ethelfled whispered. "Do you have one?" Osrith shook her head. She had two, of course. But with someone like Ethelfled, even in a moment like this where confidences could be shared, she had learned that, once power had tilted back to her, the lady would have no compunction to not use that information to her advantage, or even to her amusement, as Ethelwold had. "Eric is going to free me," Ethelfled said, and Osrith knew then what was giving her hope. "We are fleeing, to make a new life." "Not if I can help it." "You're not," Osrith vowed to the lady, silently, and instead went to the business of unloading the food, and taking away an empty platter from a previous meal. Sensing that someone was watching her, Osrith made haste, and withdrew. Ethelfled flicked a small smile at her, as she turned. And then things began to move fast, as Osrith realized that she had been right. Alfred had indeed not allowed things to be left to chance, and the first inkling she got of this was when she saw, quite clearly, CHRONOLOGICAL standing by the door, in a pose that he must have thought was nonchalant, but Osrith noticed was casually alert. A fight was unfolding in the hall, between what looked like one of Heston's men and one of Eric's, and the men had cleared a space for this to happen. But the scrap had ended prematurely when a call of "fire" rang out, and Osrith could see flames licking the night sky, consuming, she gathered, from its direction, the whole of the northern rampart and the stables. Horses were galloping, terrified, all through the courtyard, as men too blotter to see and catch them, were upended and fell in the mud and the chaos. Below her, as Osrith scrambled down, she saw that her job has been thieved. Clapper, one of Uted's men, was attempting to hammer open the chain that fixed the rope to a pulley that was holding Ethelfled's cage, and it was then she knew that it was her brother who had been Alfred's plan, and always had been, no matter what Eric had told her. Later, Osrith would consider how proper her brother really was. Despite his lifestyle, Uted wanted the prestige and order which came with Saxon hierarchy, and would chide and bully those who didn't follow his rules, and here he was ensuring the line of Alfred and the kingdom of Wessex was not consumed by the Danes and Norse, no matter how kin he felt he was to them. So, all Osrith needed to do was to allow Uted to succeed. Osrith ducked as a war axe narrowly missed her head for, incredibly, the two men who had been fighting over the woman were still fighting, despite the fact that the fortress was steadily, determinedly, being eaten up by the fire. As Ethelfled was lowered, Osrith hurried to the cage, picking up a dagger in the process from one very inebriated Dane and handing it to her through the bars. "Do not forget to fight as I showed you," she hissed to Ethelfled, before she was pulled out by Uted. Osrith saw the look pass between the lady and her brother, before, unbelievably, he pushed Ethelfled in the direction of her lover. "Go now," she heard him shout, above the noise of the chaos, and Osrith felt her heart lose its heat. Had she misread the situation? He was letting Ethelfled and Eric flee, scrambling over the bodies of prone Danes and Norse. Those standing did not look very closely as looked like them, and was trying to douse the flames which had now taken hold of the hall. She crossed the straw-strewn hall and was in arm's reach of her brother when Sihtric landed a blow which would have struck between Osrith's shoulder blades. In time, she ducked under his arm and aimed a foot at his stomach, which was enough to make him misstep. Behind Sihtric, Finan caught her, holding her body as he drew soul stealer high. Giving tagged seeks to Elfkin had been a big mistake. Osrith could not get Bue out quickly enough. Just as she expected a blade to the gut, she felt fine and stop, and let her go from his grasp. She followed his gaze, and saw, and heard words which, in her imperfect Norse, sounded like traitor and brother. Siegfried had run Eirik through. No! Osrith screamed, pushing Finan out of the way. She saw the tail end of Ethelfled, her dress streaming out of the hall's door as she was dragged along by Uthed. Finan, of course, was soon in his wake, Siegfried Thorgilson on their tail, but not for long, for the fortress burned too fiercely. If they were going to recapture Ethelfled, they would need to abandon Beamflout Fortress and clear as many men who were fit to go from it immediately. Osrith breathed deeply, as the adrenaline made her heart beat faster, and she slipped to her knees beside her dying friend as fire crackled around them. Siegfried had, at least, ensured Eirik's hand was wrapped around his sword, so he would be guaranteed Valhalla. Tears sprang to her eyes, ones born of her bond with him, of kinship in arms, and she put a hand to his cheek. Osrith ... Kriegvikvind, he managed, blood choking in his throat. And then he was gone. Gone to Valhalla, she supposed. The fire was getting more intense as Osrith's hand dropped to his, which held his sword. What would he have done? Win and lose, and feel the same about both, because both are deceivers. There would be no benefit to dying in the fire herself. Eirik Thorgilson, a man she respected, had been killed by his brother for trying to cheat him, having fallen in love with Ethelfled, and made plans to abduct her, for sliver of a chance of a life together. Elfkin, Osrith's thoughts shouted, and she looked desperately around at the slim hope of finding him amongst the blazing wood. She needed to leave the fortress, but Osrith knew that she could not do until she had done what she could to find him. Heading towards the stables, Osrith held up an arm to shelf her face from the flames. He had tagged Seeks, Osrith thought. If Elfkin was there, the weapon would be perishing with him. In her heart, she still clung to hope. He was a plucky, intelligent young boy who had sense. But she would not be leaving without him. Osrith turned and looked back to the hall. Eirik had his funeral pyre well enough, and she scanned the ramparts for any that may be intact, any that may hold her young soldier. A flicker of movement towards the south gate, and Osrith ran to it, leaping more drunken Danes and Norse, whose indulgence in strong ale would, perhaps, anesthetize the pain of burning to death. She looked up, but it could see no one. The movement might well have come from the brothers' battle standard which fluttered, ragged, on a pole, most of it flame food. Damn it! Where was he? Last time she had seen Elfkin, he had been heading back to the kitchens, and so Osrith's feet took her around the southeastern edge of the palisade wall towards the eastern entrance of the kitchen. Perhaps he was inside? This was stone-floored and two walls were made of reclaimed rocks. If he had the sense Osrith thought he had, Elfkin might well be in there. She charged inside, looking around. Beyond, the courtyard flames were beginning to climb higher and Danes and Norse were pulling one another, frantically trying to make their egress from the fortress. No Elfkin. He was not in the scullery or the food store, neither was he near the culvert, where the bourne which flowed, eventually, towards the sea was used to wash the excess of blood from animal carcasses. Think. Osrith banged her head with her hand, as the growing realization that she might have to abandon Beamflout without him began to invade her mind. Perhaps he had got out then, a conciliatory voice in her head told her. Elfkin was as clever as she thought he was, and if he could, he would have fled, and tried to get back to his older brother. So she turned to hurry from the kitchens, to take one last look around, and stepped towards the door. I know you. A voice behind her stopped Osrith in her tracks, and she looked over her shoulder. Yes, Heston the Dane continued. I know you. Osrith ran, and began to tear off across the ground between the kitchen door and the east wall. Oh no you don't. His bulk at odds with his speed, Heston followed and caught up with Osrith, holding her in a bear hug. Now, don't struggle, Wakilt, he scolded, as Osrith tried to shake her body loose, and he felt about her chest for her breasts. Pity, he added. But I have you now, and I will. But, whatever Heston was about to say was replaced by a howl of pain, and he let go of her, turning round and lashing out. But Elfkin struck his foot again with tagged seeks, as the Dane roared again. "Come on," urged Osrith, as Elfkin stood still, watching Heston dance a dance of pain from his skewered feet. Her heart was beginning to beat faster as the uplifting feeling of finding him began to sink in. "Are there any horses?" "Some," Elfkin said, and they both got out of the eastern gate. Around them, Northmen were staggering, trying to get out of the way of the inflamed building, while some were trying to drag others. Many horses were free, and were fleeing the burning, but a couple were staggering around too, as if skittish, but waiting for their masters. One close by seemed to be quite placid, a white mare which at once Elfkin hurried to, the horse's demeanor softening as he placed his hand to her mouth. Clearly, the animal knew Elfkin, who was allowing her to sniff his hand as he petted her. Slipner. That was what Eric had named the horse on which they had escaped Caeliquilid. Oh, how was it he was dead? And, for the first time, as she helped Elfkin up in front of her, Osrith knew that however bad she had felt, it would be nothing to how Ethelfled would be feeling. It felt much longer than it really had been until Osrith rode back into the mercenaries' camp. 2 guards challenged Osrith, who rode straight past their spear points. They chased her on foot, although Osrith did not notice immediately take them in, such was her desperation to get back to Aldhelm. The 2 guards who, in the moonlight, Osrith did not know, were now running to Miral's and Alfgardent, the latter appearing in his shirt, looking as if he did not expect to be disturbed.